The Nevada sun blazed mercilessly across Nellie's Air Force Base, turning the tarmac into a shimmering mirage of heat waves. 8-year-old Marcus Chen didn't care about the scorching temperature. His small hands gripped the chain-link fence so tightly his knuckles had turned white. His face pressed against the warm metal as he watched the most beautiful sight in his young world, an F-22 Raptor screaming across the desert sky. "Dad, Dad, look at that one," Marcus shouted, pointing frantically as the fighter jet executed a perfect barrel roll, its twin engines leaving contrails that painted white streaks across the brilliant blue canvas above. Colonel David Chen crouched beside his son, one hand resting gently on Marcus's shoulder, the other shielding his eyes from the sun's glare. At 40, David had logged over 3,000 flight hours, but watching Marcus's face light up with wonder never got old. The boy's enthusiasm was infectious, pure, untainted by the weight of military protocol and the harsh realities of combat that David carried every day. "That's Captain Mitchell," David explained, his voice warm with pride. "He's practicing for the air show next month. See how he maintains perfect control even in that role. That's years of training, son." Marcus turned to his father, his dark eyes sparkling with dreams too big for his small frame. "I'm gonna fly one of those someday, Dad. I'm gonna be the best pilot in the whole Air Force. Better than you, even." He grinned mischievously, showing the gap where he'd lost his front tooth the week before. David laughed, the sound deep and genuine. "Oh, you think so, huh? Better than your old man." "Way better," Marcus insisted, puffing out his chest. He held up his prized possession, a detailed die-cast model of an F-22 Raptor that David had given him for his 7th birthday. The toy was worn from constant handling, the paint chipped on the nose from where Marcus had crashed it during countless imaginary dogfights in their backyard. David pulled Marcus close, feeling the boy's small body radiating heat and energy. "You know what, Phoenix? I believe you. You've got the heart for it, the passion. That's what makes a great pilot, not just skill, but love for the sky." "Phoenix," Marcus repeated dreamily, rolling the call sign around in his mouth like candy. It was his favorite word in the world. David had started calling him that 6 months ago after Marcus had drawn a picture of a bird rising from flames in art class. When David asked about it, Marcus had explained, "It's me, Dad. Even if I crash, I'll always rise up again, just like you taught me." The name had stuck. Now Marcus insisted everyone call him Phoenix, his mother, his teachers, even his friends at school. He'd written it on all his notebooks, drawn it on his bedroom wall with permanent marker, much to Sarah's dismay, and signed his homework with it. Another F-22 roared overhead, this one flying so low they could feel the thunderous vibration in their chests. Marcus jumped up and down, waving frantically even though he knew the pilot couldn't see him. "Dad," Marcus said, suddenly serious as the jet disappeared beyond the horizon, "promise me something." "Anything, buddy. Promise that one day you'll take me up. In a real plane, not just the simulator at the museum. A real one where I can feel the clouds and see the earth below and know what it's like to really fly." David's throat tightened with emotion. He'd been planning to surprise Marcus with exactly that, a flight in his Cessna 172 this coming Saturday for the boy's 8th birthday. But hearing the raw longing in his son's voice made the moment even more special. "Marcus Phoenix," David corrected himself with a smile. "I promise you this Saturday for your birthday we're going up in my Cessna, just you and me. I'll let you take the controls and you'll feel what it's like to really fly." Marcus's eyes went impossibly wide. "Really? You mean it? You're not joking?" "Have I ever broken a promise to you?" "Never." Marcus launched himself at his father, wrapping his thin arms around David's neck. "You're the best dad in the whole universe. Wait until I tell Mom. And Tommy at school, he's gonna be so jealous." David held his son tight, breathing in the scent of boy sweat and sunshine and that strawberry shampoo Sarah insisted on using. These moments, these perfect crystalline moments, were what made everything else worthwhile. The long deployments, the dangerous missions, the nights he couldn't sleep because of what he'd seen. All of it faded when Marcus looked at him like he hung the moon and stars. "Come on," David said, standing and taking Marcus's hand. "We need to head home and pack. Or did you forget? We've got a flight to catch to Grandma and Grandpa's house in California tomorrow morning." Marcus groaned dramatically. "Do we have to take a commercial flight? Can't you just fly us there in an F-22? I don't think the Air Force would appreciate me using a $30 million fighter jet as a family taxi, Phoenix. But it would be so much cooler." They walked toward the parking lot, Marcus chattering nonstop about everything he'd learned about aerodynamics from the library books David had gotten him. The boy's enthusiasm was unstoppable. He absorbed information like a sponge, constantly asking questions that sometimes even David had to look up. "Dad," Marcus asked as David buckled him into the back seat of their Honda. "Yeah, buddy. After we go to Grandma's, and after you take me up in the Cessna, can we come back here and watch the F-22s again?" David's heart swelled. "Every weekend if you want, it's a promise." "You promise a lot of things," Marcus observed with the blunt honesty of childhood. "That's because I always keep them," David replied, meeting his son's eyes in the rearview mirror. Marcus smiled, holding up his toy F-22 and making it soar through the air. "Phoenix to base, requesting permission for takeoff," he announced in his best pilot voice. "Permission granted, Phoenix. Fly safe." "Always, Dad, always." The next morning, as they boarded Flight 447 at Las Vegas McCarran International Airport, Marcus pressed his face against the terminal window, watching an F-22 taxi across the distant runway. He waved at it frantically, his toy clutched in his other hand. "Maybe that pilot can see me," he said hopefully. Sarah Chen smiled, smoothing down her son's perpetually messy hair. "Maybe, sweetheart." David watched them both, his wife and son, his whole world, and felt a contentment so complete it was almost frightening. In 20 minutes they'd be in the air. In 3 hours they'd be in California. Saturday he'd fulfill his promise and take Marcus flying. He had no way of knowing that in 23 minutes, everything he loved would be gone. As Flight 447 taxied down the runway, Marcus pressed his face against the oval window, still waving at the distant F-22. His last words before takeoff were whispered to his toy. "One day, Phoenix. One day we'll fly together for real." The engines roared to life, and the plane lifted into the bright Nevada sky. Flight 447 reached its cruising altitude of 31,000 feet 18 minutes after takeoff. Marcus had his nose pressed against the window, watching the patchwork quilt of Nevada desert give way to the jagged peaks of the Sierra Nevada mountains. His toy rested on the tray table before him, positioned as if it were flying alongside the commercial airliner. "Mom, look, you can see the whole world from up here," Marcus exclaimed, his breath fogging the cold window. Sarah smiled, reaching across the aisle to squeeze his hand. "Beautiful, isn't it, sweetheart?" 3 rows back, David had his eyes closed, reviewing flight protocols in his mind, a habit he couldn't break even on civilian flights. He was a passenger today, not a pilot, but his instincts never truly shut off. The engines hummed their steady rhythm, a sound he found comforting after years in the cockpit. Then everything changed. A sound like a thunderclap shattered the peaceful drone of the engines. The aircraft lurched violently to the left. Overhead compartments burst open, raining luggage and belongings onto screaming passengers. The oxygen masks dropped with a mechanical thunk that seemed impossibly loud in the chaos. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Rodriguez. We're experiencing technical difficulties. Please remain calm and—" The intercom cut out as the plane shuddered again, more violently this time. David's eyes snapped open, his military training taking over instantly. His mind processed everything in seconds: the angle of the aircraft, the sound of the struggling engine, the smell of smoke beginning to filter through the cabin. Engine failure, catastrophic, left side. "Sarah, Marcus!" David unbuckled, fighting against the tilting cabin to reach his family. Passengers around him screamed, prayed, clutched each other. The plane was dropping fast, the altimeter in David's mind calculating their descent rate with horrifying precision. Sarah had already secured Marcus's oxygen mask and her own, her face pale but determined. She'd been a military wife long enough to know panic solved nothing, but her hands trembled as she held their son. Marcus, remarkably, wasn't screaming. His small fingers gripped the toy F-22 so tightly the metal edges cut into his palm, drawing tiny beads of blood. His eyes were wide but focused, locked on his father's face as David fought his way to them. "Dad," Marcus called out, his voice muffled by the oxygen mask but steady. "What's happening?" David reached them, pulling both wife and son into his arms as the plane continued its sickening descent. Through the window, he could see the left engine, or what remained of it, trailing black smoke and flames. Pieces of metal tore away in the slipstream. They were over the mountains now, those beautiful, deadly peaks that looked so majestic from the ground. "Listen to me, Phoenix," David said, gripping Marcus's shoulders and looking directly into his son's eyes. He needed Marcus to hear this, needed these words to matter. "You're the bravest pilot I know. The bravest. Remember that. Always remember that." "I'm scared, Dad," Marcus whispered, and for the first time tears spilled down his cheeks. "I know, buddy, I know, but you're Phoenix, remember. You rise from the ashes, you always rise." The plane shuddered again, dropping 1,000 feet in seconds. Sarah clutched both of them, her face buried in Marcus's hair, whispering prayers David couldn't hear over the screaming of metal and wind and terrified passengers. Marcus suddenly pulled back from his father, holding up the toy F-22 with shaking hands. "Dad, take it, for Saturday. When we go flying, you hold onto it for me." David's heart shattered into 1,000 pieces. He wanted to lie, to promise everything would be okay, but he'd never lied to Marcus before and he wouldn't start now. Not in these final moments. Instead, he closed Marcus's small fingers around the toy fighter. "No, Phoenix, you hold on to it. You keep flying no matter what. Promise me, keep flying." "I promise, Dad, I promise." The mountains were rushing up to meet them now, granite peaks like teeth waiting to devour the falling aircraft. The pilots were fighting desperately for control. David could feel it in the way the plane responded, the way they were trying to glide, to find any flat space in that unforgiving terrain. Marcus pressed his face against David's chest, still clutching the toy. He was whispering something, over and over, and David strained to hear his son's final words. "Phoenix, a Phoenix, Phoenix." The cabin lights flickered. The plane's nose dropped sharply. Through the window, David saw a mountain peak filling his vision. Sarah screamed. Marcus held tighter. David wrapped his arms around both of them, trying impossibly to shield them with his body. "I love you both," David gasped. "I love." The impact was instant, catastrophic, final. Flight 447 struck the mountainside at over 300 miles per hour. The fuselage crumpled like paper, metal shrieking as it tore apart. Fire bloomed instantly, consuming everything. 147 passengers and crew became 44 casualties in less than 2 seconds. The sound echoed across the empty mountains, then faded into terrible silence. 3 days later, rescue crews found the wreckage scattered across half a mile of unforgiving terrain. The crash site looked like hell itself: blackened metal, scorched earth, and the unspeakable debris of lives ended too soon. They found Marcus's body 50 yards from the main fuselage, still strapped in his seat. Somehow, impossibly, his toy F-22 remained clutched in his small hand. The plastic had melted and warped from the fire, fused to his palm, but it was recognizable. Colonel David Chen had been thrown clear in the impact. He survived with 3 broken ribs, a shattered collarbone, a severe concussion, and injuries that would heal in months. The injuries to his soul would never heal. They brought him Marcus's toy after they'd finished processing the scene. The chaplain placed it in David's hands with tears in his eyes. David stared at the melted plastic and metal, at the last thing his son had held, and something inside him broke so fundamentally that he knew he'd never be whole again. Sarah Chen had died on impact, sitting beside their son. They'd been holding hands. The NTSB investigation took 6 months. The conclusion: catastrophic engine failure due to a microscopic fracture in the turbine blade, undetectable during routine maintenance. A 1 in a million failure, a tragedy that no one could have prevented. David attended every hearing, read every report, memorized every technical detail. He needed to understand how the universe had stolen his family, but understanding didn't bring them back. Marcus Chen was buried with full military honors at Arlington National Cemetery, his father's request, approved by special consideration. He was only 8 years old, but David insisted his son had earned it. The little boy who dreamed of flying F-22s was laid to rest with his melted toy fighter. The headstone read simply, Marcus Phoenix Chen, born to fly, forever soaring. 3 months after the funeral, Colonel David Chen requested and received a transfer. He couldn't fly anymore, couldn't bring himself to climb into a cockpit without seeing Marcus's face pressed against a window. But he could teach. He could train the next generation. He could make sure no pilot under his command ever forgot that flying wasn't just about skill. It was about bringing everyone home safely. David became an F-22 instructor at Nellis Air Force Base, the same base where Marcus had pressed his face against the fence and dreamed of flying. Some wounds never heal. They just become part of who you are. Every night David stood in Marcus's room, left exactly as it had been. The model jets on the shelves, the drawings of aircraft taped to the walls, the bed made with military precision, waiting for a boy who would never come home. And every night before turning out the light, David whispered the same words, "Keep flying, Phoenix. Wherever you are, keep flying." He had no idea how literally those words would come true. 15 years had carved deep lines into Colonel David Chen's face, etching pain into every crevice. At 53, his hair had gone completely gray, his shoulders permanently set in a rigid line that spoke of unbearable weight. The man who had once laughed easily with his son had become something else entirely, a statue of discipline, a fortress of control. Nellis Air Force Base knew him as the hardest instructor in the F-22 program. Some called him brilliant, others called him merciless. None called him friend. Again, David's voice cut through the simulation room like a blade. Captain Emily Rodriguez sat in the cockpit simulator, sweat dripping down her face despite the air conditioning. She just failed her 6th landing approach of the morning. "Sir, with respect, the weather parameters you've set are beyond." "Beyond what, Captain? Beyond possible, beyond survivable." David's dark eyes bored into her. "Tell that to the 44 people on Flight 447 who encountered the impossible. Tell them it was beyond parameters." Emily bit back her response. Everyone knew about Colonel Chen's family. It was base legend, whispered in barracks and repeated in mess halls. The instructor who'd lost everything, who drove his students to the breaking point because he'd seen what happened when systems failed. "Run it again," David said quietly, his voice somehow more frightening when it wasn't raised. "And this time, remember that every decision you make in that cockpit determines whether someone's son comes home, whether someone's daughter gets to grow up, whether a father has to bury a child." Emily swallowed hard and reset the simulation. In the observation room, Lieutenant Jake Morrison watched through the glass, his stomach knotting. He was up next. At 26, Morrison was the youngest pilot in their class, a prodigy who'd earned his wings faster than anyone in recent history. But Colonel Chen's program had humbled him daily for 6 months. "He's brutal," muttered Captain Stevens, standing beside Morrison. "My last instructor was tough, but Chen, he's something else." "He's keeping us alive," Morrison replied, surprising himself with the defense. "Everything he teaches, it's like he's seen every possible way we could die up there and he's determined to prevent it." Stevens grunted. "Yeah, well, some of us think he's just working out his own demons on his students." Morrison said nothing. He'd researched Colonel Chen obsessively after being assigned to his program. He'd found the news articles about the crash, read the NTSB reports, even found an old video of 8-year-old Marcus Chen at a school science fair, presenting a project on aerodynamics with infectious enthusiasm. The boy had been brilliant, full of life, and he died clutching a toy fighter jet, still believing in the dream his father had given him. Morrison understood why Colonel Chen pushed so hard. If anything, he didn't push hard enough. That evening, David drove to the house he still couldn't bring himself to sell. Sarah's car sat in the garage, covered with a tarp, tires flat from 15 years of disuse. He'd kept making the payments on it, couldn't explain why. Inside, everything remained frozen in time. Sarah's book still lay open on the coffee table, her reading glasses marking the page she'd never finish. Marcus's backpack hung on its hook by the door, still packed with homework he'd never turn in. David climbed the stairs, his footsteps heavy on carpet that desperately needed replacing. He paused at the master bedroom. He slept in the guest room now, couldn't bear their bed, and continued to the room at the end of the hall. Marcus's room. David opened the door slowly, like he did every evening. The model jet still lined the shelves, gathering dust he couldn't bring himself to wipe away. The walls were covered with drawings of aircraft, some remarkably skilled for an 8-year-old. In the corner, Marcus's small desk held notebooks filled with airplane doodles and calculations that made David's chest ache. On the nightstand sat a photograph from that last morning at the air base. Marcus pressed against the fence, his face radiant with joy, David's hand on his shoulder. Both of them looking up at an F-22 screaming across the sky. David picked up the photo, his thumb tracing Marcus's smile. "I trained 63 pilots this year, Phoenix," David whispered to the empty room. 63. They all went home to their families. They all stayed safe." He paused, his voice breaking. "I kept them safe for you." It was a ritual, this nightly conversation with a ghost. David knew it was unhealthy. The base psychiatrist had told him so repeatedly, but it was all he had left. "Tomorrow's your birthday," David continued, setting the photo down carefully. 23 years old, you'd be older than Morrison. Might have been training alongside him. He smiled bitterly. "You'd have been better. You were always going to be better." On the shelf, the melted remains of Marcus's toy F-22 sat in a glass case. David had kept it, this warped piece of metal and plastic that had survived what his son couldn't. Sometimes he hated it. Sometimes it was the only thing that felt real. His phone buzzed. A text from Major Hawkins. "Chen, you need to see tomorrow's assignment. Operation Sentinel Shield. Rodriguez and Morrison selected. Training Zone Sierra 7. David's blood went cold. Sierra 7. The same mountain range where Flight 447 had gone down. The same peaks that had killed his family. He texted back, "Change the zone." The response came immediately. "Can't. Orders from above, political VIPs observing, the routes locked in." David sat on Marcus's bed, the springs creaking under his weight. 15 years, and he'd successfully avoided that airspace. He'd maneuvered every training exercise, every simulation, every flight path to keep his students away from those mountains. Now they were sending his two best pilots directly into the graveyard of his past. "I can't do this," David whispered to the darkness. "Phoenix, I can't send them there." The room offered no answer. It never did. David pulled out his phone and looked at the assignment details. Operation Sentinel Shield, a high-stakes defense training exercise designed to test pilot response to extreme scenarios. Rodriguez and Morrison would fly through a challenging corridor in the Sierra Nevada range, simulating a critical intercept mission. The flight path would take them within 5 miles of where Marcus had died. David's hands trembled as he read the specifications: engine stress tests, high-altitude maneuvers, emergency response protocols, everything designed to push the aircraft to their limits. Everything that could go wrong. "Sir?" A voice startled him. David looked up to find Sarah standing in the doorway, her hair gray now, her face lined with grief that mirrored his own. She still lived in the house, though they existed more as ghosts haunting the same space than as a married couple. "I didn't hear you come in," David said. "You never do when you're in here." Sarah stepped into the room, something she rarely did anymore. "I saw the assignment notification. Sierra 7. I can't stop it." "I know." She sat beside him on their son's bed. They hadn't touched in years, but tonight she took his hand. "David, maybe it's time." "Time for what?" "To let go, to stop punishing yourself, to stop trying to save Marcus by saving every other pilot who comes through your program." David's jaw clenched. "I'm keeping them safe." "You're killing yourself, and you're scaring them. Morrison told Stevens you made a student cry last week. Lieutenant Brooks made a critical error in judgment that would have gotten her killed in combat. She's 23 years old, David. She's learning. They're all learning. You can't expect perfection from them just because you couldn't save." Sarah stopped, biting her lip. "Say it," David said coldly. "Just say it." "I couldn't save our son either," Sarah whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I was sitting right next to him and I couldn't save him. You think you're the only one who carries that. You're not. But I'm not trying to resurrect him through every young pilot who walks onto this base." David stood abruptly, moving to the window. Outside, the Nevada night was crystal clear, stars scattered across the darkness like diamonds. Somewhere up there, F-22s were running night exercises, their engines distant thunder. "Tomorrow morning, Rodriguez and Morrison fly Sierra 7, David said finally. "And I'm going to make damn sure they come home. That's all I can do, Sarah. That's all I have left." Sarah rose, pausing at the door. "He wouldn't want this, you know, Marcus. He wouldn't want you to stop living just because he did." After she left, David stood alone in his son's room, surrounded by the dreams of a boy who'd never grow old. On the shelf, a model F-22 seemed to watch him in the darkness. "I'm sorry, Phoenix," David whispered. "I'm so sorry." Tomorrow, his students would fly through the mountains that had killed his son, and David Chen would have to watch, powerless once again, praying that history wouldn't repeat itself. He had no way of knowing that Marcus had been listening all along. Dawn broke over Nellie's Air Force Base with an oppressive stillness that made David Chen's skin crawl. He'd been awake since 3 a.m., reviewing flight plans, checking weather reports, running through every possible scenario that could go wrong. His coffee had gone cold hours ago, untouched on his desk beside the mission brief. Operation Sentinel Shield, 800 hours, 2 F-22 Raptors, Sierra 7 airspace. The same mountains that had swallowed his family 15 years ago. Captain Emily Rodriguez arrived at the briefing room at 6:30, her flight suit crisp, her dark hair pulled back in a regulation bun. She carried herself with the confidence of someone who'd earned her wings through pure skill, but David saw the tension in her shoulders. She knew about the crash site. Every pilot in his program knew. Lieutenant Jake Morrison entered 5 minutes later, his young face set with determination. At 26, he reminded David painfully of himself at that age, cocky, brilliant, absolutely certain he was invincible. The kind of pilot who could either become legendary or become a statistic. "Seats," David ordered, his voice carrying the weight of a sleepless night. Both pilots sat ramrod straight, eyes forward. The briefing room felt smaller than usual, the walls pressing in. David pulled up the tactical display, showing the mountain range in stark detail. His finger traced the flight path, passing within 5 miles of the crash site. He forced his voice to remain steady, professional. Operation Sentinel Shield simulates a critical intercept scenario. You'll be flying through Sierra 7 corridor at Angels 30, that's 30,000 feet, conducting a high-speed pursuit exercise. The target is a simulated hostile drone that will be maneuvering aggressively through the mountain passes. "Rules of engagement, sir," Rodriguez asked. "Weapons cold. This is radar lock and tracking only. Your objective is to maintain pursuit contact for 15 minutes through challenging terrain while managing fuel, G-forces, and communication protocols." David's eyes locked onto Morrison. "This is not a race, Lieutenant. This is a precision exercise. Speed without control kills." Morrison nodded, but David saw the flash of competitive fire in the young pilot's eyes. He'd seen that look before, in himself, in Marcus. "Weather?" Rodriguez asked, studying the displays. David hesitated. The morning forecast had shown clear skies, but something felt wrong. Call it instinct, call it paranoia, but his gut was screaming warnings. Current conditions show clear visibility, winds at 15 knots from the northwest. However, Sierra 7 is known for rapid weather changes. Maintain constant situational awareness. He pulled up the terrain map, highlighting the peaks. These mountains are unforgiving. At your altitude and speed, you'll have approximately 3 seconds to react to any emergency. 3 seconds between life and death. I need you both to understand that." "We understand, sir," they answered in unison. David studied them both, 2 of the finest pilots he'd trained. Rodriguez was methodical, calculating, never took unnecessary risks. Morrison was instinctive, talented beyond measure, but sometimes too confident. Together, they made a formidable team. Together, they were about to fly through his nightmares. "One more thing," David said quietly. 15 years ago, Flight 447 went down in Sierra 7. 44 casualties, including," his voice caught. He cleared his throat. "Including civilians. I tell you this not to make you nervous, but to remind you that every flight carries weight. Every decision matters. Respect the sky, respect your aircraft, and come home safe." The room fell silent. Rodriguez and Morrison exchanged glances, the gravity of the moment settling over them like a shroud. "Any questions?" David asked. "No, sir," Rodriguez said firmly. Morrison raised his hand slightly. "Sir, we'll make you proud. We'll execute this perfectly." David's jaw tightened. Marcus had said something similar that last morning. "I'm gonna be the best pilot in the whole Air Force. Better than you, even." "I don't need perfect, Lieutenant," David said, his voice rough with emotion he couldn't quite suppress. "I need you both back on the ground alive. That's all that matters." At 7:45 hours, David stood in the command center, surrounded by monitors displaying every conceivable piece of data. Weather radar, aircraft telemetry, radio frequencies. Major Hawkins worked the communications console, while 3 technicians monitored system readouts. Through the reinforced windows, David watched Rodriguez and Morrison complete their pre-flight checks. 2 F-22 Raptors sat gleaming on the tarmac, their angular stealth profiles looking like predatory birds ready to hunt. Eagle 1 and Eagle 2, Rodriguez and Morrison. David's stomach churned with acid and dread. "All systems green," Hawkins reported. "Birds are ready to fly." David picked up the radio headset with trembling hands. "Eagle 1, Eagle 2, this is base command. Radio check." "Eagle 1, loud and clear." Rodriguez's voice came through crisp and professional. "Eagle 2, reading you 5 by 5, Morrison added. unable to keep the excitement entirely out of his voice. "Copy that. You are cleared for taxi to runway 27. Operation Sentinel Shield is go." David watched as both aircraft began rolling toward the runway, their engines building to a roar even at idle. The sound vibrated through the command center windows, a familiar thunder that once would have thrilled him. Now it just filled him with dread. Sarah had called that morning just before dawn. "Promise me you'll let them do their jobs," she'd said. "Promise me you won't let your ghosts interfere." He'd promised, but watching these two pilots taxi toward the same sky that had killed his son, David wondered if that was a promise he could keep. "Weather update," one of the technicians announced. "Satellite shows cloud formation building faster than predicted over Sierra 7, still within safe parameters, but it's developing quickly." David's instincts screamed louder. "Get me real-time data. I want updates every 2 minutes." "Sir, the formation is still." "Every 2 minutes," David snapped. "Those mountains eat aircraft. I won't lose anyone else to them." The command center went silent. Everyone knew about Colonel Chen's family. They knew this mission was personal in ways that went beyond any professional protocol. "Eagle 1 and Eagle 2, David's voice carried across the radio. "Be advised, weather patterns over Sierra 7 are developing faster than forecast. Maintain constant awareness and be prepared to abort if conditions deteriorate." "Copy that base command," Rodriguez acknowledged. "We're ready for anything." David wished he believed that. He'd been ready too 15 years ago. He'd been a decorated combat pilot with thousands of hours of experience. And it hadn't mattered. When the universe decided to take everything, no amount of training or preparation could stop it. "Eagles, you are cleared for takeoff. Godspeed." The F-22s rolled onto the runway, their engines building to full power. Even from inside the command center, the sound was overwhelming. 200,000 pounds of thrust, generating enough power to tear through the sky at supersonic speeds. Rodriguez went first, Eagle 1 accelerating down the runway with breathtaking speed, nose lifting, wheels leaving pavement, climbing sharply into the crystal blue morning. Seconds later, Morrison followed, Eagle 2 rising to join his wingman in perfect formation. David watched them climb, two silver specks growing smaller against the vast Nevada sky, heading toward the mountains that haunted every moment of his existence. "Time to Sierra 7 corridor, 18 minutes, Hawkins announced. 18 minutes. David's hands gripped the edge of the console until his knuckles went white. On the monitor, he could see the crash site marker on the terrain map, a small red X where Flight 447 had ended, where Marcus had clutched his toy fighter and whispered his call sign and died believing his father's promises. "Eagle Flight, proceed to waypoint Alpha," David ordered, his voice steadier than he felt. "Eagle 1 Wilco," Rodriguez confirmed. "Eagle 2 copy," Morrison added. The formation banked east, toward the Sierra Nevada range. On the weather radar, that cloud formation continued building, dark pixels spreading across the screen like a stain. Something was wrong. David felt it in his bones, the same way he'd felt it on Flight 447 seconds before the engine exploded. "Eagles, I'm seeing rapid weather development. Stay sharp." "Copy that base command. We've got eyes on." 15 minutes now. David stared at the monitors, watching altitude readings, speed indicators, fuel consumption, every number that could mean the difference between triumph and tragedy. Beside him, Hawkins and the technicians worked in focused silence, everyone feeling the weight of Colonel Chen's ghosts pressing down on the room. On the largest monitor, the F-22s appeared as two blips moving steadily toward the mountain range, toward Sierra 7, toward the place where David's world had ended 15 years ago. Toward destiny. David closed his eyes briefly, saw Marcus's face pressed against that airplane window, heard his son's voice. "Keep flying, Phoenix. Keep flying." Eagles approaching Sierra 7 corridor in 5 minutes, Hawkins announced. David opened his eyes, staring at the screens with an intensity that bordered on desperation. "Stay safe," he whispered. "Please, God, let them stay safe." But deep in his heart, he knew. The mountains were hungry, and they always had been. The Sierra Nevada mountains rose before them like ancient sentinels, their granite peaks piercing through wisps of cloud that had materialized faster than any weather model predicted. Captain Emily Rodriguez checked her instruments for the 10th time in as many seconds. Everything showed green, but her instincts were screaming warnings she couldn't articulate. "Eagle 2, you seeing this cloud buildup?" she asked, her voice steady despite the unease crawling up her spine. "Affirmative, Eagle 1, Lieutenant Jake Morrison replied, his F-22 holding perfect formation off her right wing. "Still within parameters, but it's getting thick fast." They'd been in the air for 23 minutes, maintaining 30,000 feet as they entered the Sierra 7 corridor. Below them, the mountains spread out in deadly beauty, the same peaks that had claimed Flight 447, though neither pilot mentioned it. They didn't need to. The weight of Colonel Chen's warnings hung heavy in their cockpits. "Eagles, base command," David Chen's voice crackled through their headsets. "Weather deterioration accelerating. I'm seeing buildup that shouldn't be there. Recommend you execute the exercise quickly and get clear of the corridor." "Copy that, base," Rodriguez started to respond. Then Lieutenant Morrison's world exploded. The warning came without preamble, a shriek of alarms that turned Morrison's cockpit into a hellscape of red lights and screaming alerts. His left engine temperature spiked from normal to critical in less than 2 seconds, the gauge climbing impossibly fast. "Eagle 2, I've got." Morrison's voice cut off as the engine detonated. The explosion was catastrophic. Metal fragments tore through the engine housing, shredding turbine blades that spun at thousands of RPM. The F-22 shuddered violently, yawing hard left as asymmetric thrust tried to flip the aircraft into an uncontrollable spin. "Mayday, Mayday," Morrison shouted, fighting the controls with every ounce of his training. "Eagle 2 experiencing catastrophic engine failure. I'm losing it." In the command center, David Chen's heart stopped. The words echoed through his mind, superimposing over memories 15 years old. "Engine failure, catastrophic, engine failure." "Morrison, shut down the damaged engine," David barked into the radio, his voice sharp with controlled panic. "Compensate with right engine and—" "I'm trying." Morrison's voice was strained, punctuated by the sound of alarms. "She's not responding. The fire's spreading to the right engine. I'm getting temperature spikes across the board." Rodriguez broke formation, pulling alongside her wingman's stricken aircraft. What she saw made her blood run cold. Morrison's F-22 was trailing thick black smoke from the left side, flames visible even through the smoke. The aircraft was shaking violently, dropping altitude at an alarming rate. "Jake, you need to eject, now," Rodriguez screamed. "Negative, the ejection system's offline. Shrapnel must have damaged the sequence." Morrison's voice cracked with fear he could no longer hide. "I'm locked in. The canopy won't blow." The F-22 began a sickening spin, nose dropping toward the jagged peaks below. Morrison pulled back on the stick with desperate strength, but the aircraft refused to respond. He was trapped in $30 million of cutting-edge technology that had become his coffin, falling toward the same mountains that had killed Colonel Chen's family. "Base command, I need options," Morrison shouted, raw terror finally breaking through his training. He was 26 years old and he was going to die. In the command center, David stood frozen, watching history repeat itself with horrifying precision. The telemetry showed Morrison's aircraft at 28,000 feet and dropping fast. 15 seconds to impact. Maybe 20 if he was lucky. "Morrison, listen to me," David's voice broke. He had no options, no solutions, nothing but impotent rage at a universe that kept taking everything from him. "I'm sorry, I'm so." Then, through the chaos of alarms and static and screaming engines, a voice cut through both Morrison's and Rodriguez's headsets with crystalline clarity. A child's voice. "Phoenix, listen carefully." Morrison's hands froze on the controls. Rodriguez's breath caught in her throat. The voice was impossibly young, maybe 8 or 9 years old, but it carried an authority and calm that defied its youth. "Kill your right engine, now." Morrison's training warred with disbelief. Kill the only working engine. That was insanity. That was suicide. "Do it now," the child's voice commanded, and something in that tone, something ancient and certain, made Morrison's hands move before his mind could catch up. He shut down the right engine. The F-22 stopped shaking. The asymmetric thrust that had been tearing the aircraft apart suddenly disappeared, and for one crystalline moment, Morrison had control again. The aircraft was gliding now, both engines dead, but it was responding to his inputs. "Bank left 30 degrees, the voice continued, calm and precise. "You're at 24,000 feet. The valley is northwest at your 10 o'clock. See it?" Morrison looked where the voice directed and saw it. A narrow valley between two peaks, barely wide enough for his wingspan, but it was there. "I see it," he gasped, banking the aircraft with trembling hands. "Drop flaps to 20 degrees. You need to bleed speed but maintain control. Do it smoothly." Morrison complied, his hands moving with mechanical precision as the child's voice guided him through impossible maneuvers. Rodriguez followed, her own aircraft shadowing Morrison's death glide, too stunned to speak. "Your glide ratio is better than you think," the voice said, and Morrison could swear he heard a smile in it. "F-22s are beautiful even when they're falling. Trust her, trust yourself." "Who are you?" Morrison whispered, tears streaming down his face as he fought to keep the aircraft stable. "Someone who understands," the voice replied softly, "someone who's been here before." In the command center, David Chen stood paralyzed, listening to the transmission. He couldn't hear the child's voice through the radio, only Morrison and Rodriguez could. But he heard Morrison's responses, heard his pilot following instructions from someone who shouldn't exist. "Altitude 18,000 feet, the child's voice announced. "You're doing great, Jake, almost there. Your ejection system will reset in 3, 2, 1. Now, eject now." Morrison didn't hesitate. His hand slammed down on the ejection handle. This time, the canopy blew clear with explosive force. The rocket motor in his seat ignited, launching him skyward as his crippled F-22 continued its terminal glide. The parachute deployed with a snap that jerked Morrison's entire body. Below him, his aircraft struck the mountainside and exploded in a massive fireball that echoed across the peaks like thunder. Morrison hung in the sky, watching his fighter, his beautiful, deadly fighter, consumed by flames. But he was alive. Rodriguez circled overhead, her voice shaking as she radioed. "Base command, Eagle 2 has successfully ejected. I repeat, pilot is safe. Parachute deployed, tracking his descent." In the command center, David Chen's legs gave out. He collapsed into his chair, his entire body shaking with relief and confusion and something else, something he couldn't name. "Did anyone else hear that?" Rodriguez's voice came through the radio, trembling. The voice, the child's voice giving instructions. Did anyone else? "Eagle 1, say again," Hawkins asked, looking at David with confusion. "There was a child," Rodriguez insisted, "on our frequency, giving Morrison instructions, step by step. That's the only reason he's alive." David's blood turned to ice. "What did the voice say?" he asked, his own voice barely a whisper. Rodriguez hesitated then. "The voice called itself Phoenix, sir, and just before Morrison ejected, I heard it say something else. It said," her voice cracked, "it said, 'It's okay, Dad, I'm still flying.'" The command center erupted in confused chatter, technicians checking frequencies, reviewing recordings, trying to find the source of an impossible transmission. But David Chen heard none of it. He stood slowly, his eyes fixed on the monitor showing the crash site. Morrison's F-22 had gone down less than 2 miles from where Flight 447 had ended 15 years ago. 2 miles from where Marcus had died, clutching a toy fighter jet and whispering his call sign. "Phoenix," David whispered, tears streaming down his weathered face. His son had answered. Nellie's Air Force Base descended into controlled chaos within minutes of Morrison's ejection. Rescue helicopters scrambled toward the Sierra 7 corridor, medical teams prepped for trauma response, and the command center transformed into a hive of activity as personnel tried to understand what had just happened. But David Chen stood motionless in the center of it all, staring at a monitor displaying the crash coordinates with tears streaming silently down his face. "Sir," Major Hawkins touched David's shoulder gently. "Sir, we need to coordinate the rescue operation. Morrison's alive, but we need to extract him before." "Play it back," David interrupted, his voice hollow. "Sorry." "The radio transmission. Play back everything from the moment Morrison's engine failed." Hawkins exchanged worried glances with the communications technician. "Colonel, we need to focus on." "Play it back." David's voice cracked like a whip, silencing the entire command center. The technician's fingers flew across the keyboard, pulling up the audio logs. The room filled with the terrible sounds of Morrison's crisis, the screaming alarms, his panicked voice, Rodriguez's desperate commands. David listened to it all, his fists clenched so tightly his nails drew blood from his palms. Then came Morrison's responses to instructions no one else could hear. "Kill the right engine, but that's okay, I'm doing it. Banking left 30 degrees, I see the valley." "Who are you?" The command center audio showed only Morrison's side of the conversation, silence where the mysterious voice should have been. But Morrison was clearly responding to someone, following precise instructions that had saved his life. "There's nothing there," the technician said, confused. "No external transmission on any frequency. It's like he was talking to himself." "He wasn't," David said quietly. "Rodriguez heard it too. Pull her transmission." They switched to Rodriguez's channel. Her voice came through clear. Did anyone else hear that? The voice. The child's voice giving instructions. And then, barely audible beneath the static and engine noise, it said, "It's okay, Dad, I'm still flying." David's knees buckled. Hawkins caught him before he fell, guiding him into a chair. "Get me Morrison and Rodriguez," David ordered, his voice shaking. "The moment they're debriefed, I want them in my office. And I want every single second of that transmission analyzed by our best audio specialists. I don't care if you have to wake them up. Do it now." 3 hours later, Lieutenant Jake Morrison sat in a hospital bed at Nellie's Medical Center, wrapped in a thermal blanket despite the warm room. His hands still trembled from adrenaline crash. Physically, he was unharmed. A few bruises from the ejection, nothing serious. Mentally, he was struggling to process what had happened. Captain Emily Rodriguez sat in the chair beside his bed, her flight suit still on, her face pale. Neither of them had spoken much since the rescue helicopter had pulled Morrison from the mountainside. The door opened. Colonel David Chen entered, and both pilots instinctively tried to stand at attention. "At ease," David said softly. "Please sit." He pulled up a chair facing them both, his eyes red-rimmed, his face haggard. For a long moment he just looked at them, as if searching for something he couldn't name. "Tell me everything," David finally said. "Every detail about the voice. I need to know." Morrison and Rodriguez exchanged glances. Morrison spoke first, his voice hesitant. "Sir, I know how this sounds. I know it's impossible. But there was something on our frequency. A child, maybe 8 or 9 years old." "Gender?" David asked. "Male," Morrison said immediately. "Definitely male. He had this slight lisp on his C sounds, and his voice. Morrison struggled for words. It was calm, sir. I was dying, my aircraft was falling apart, and this kid sounded like he was explaining homework. Completely certain, completely in control. Rodriguez nodded. I heard it too, Colonel, clear as day. At first I thought maybe it was interference from a civilian frequency, some kid with a radio who happened to break through. But the instructions, she shook her head. Sir, that child knew flight dynamics that would challenge a veteran pilot. He knew the exact glide ratio of an F-22 with both engines dead. He knew the terrain. He guided Jake through an impossible landing sequence. What else did he say? David's voice was barely a whisper. Besides the instructions, did he say anything else? Morrison's eyes filled with tears. He called himself Phoenix, and when I asked who he was, he said, someone who understands, someone who's been here before. David's breath caught in his throat. Rodriguez continued, her own voice breaking. At the end, just before Jake ejected, I heard him say something. It wasn't directed at Jake, it was. She looked directly at David. Sir, he said, it's okay, Dad, I'm still flying. He said it like he was reassuring someone he loved. The room fell silent except for the beeping of medical monitors. David sat motionless, his face a mask of controlled anguish. Colonel Chen, Morrison said carefully, I read about your son, about Marcus, about what happened 15 years ago. He paused. My crash site was less than 2 miles from where Flight 447 went down, wasn't it? David nodded slowly. Sir, Morrison continued, his voice shaking, I don't believe in ghosts. I don't believe in the supernatural. I'm a man of science, of physics, of things I can measure and calculate. But that voice saved my life. And I think it was. My son, David finished, tears streaming down his face. You think it was my son? The words hung in the air like a prayer. Rodriguez pulled out her phone, her hands trembling. Colonel, I know this is against protocol, but I recorded the last 30 seconds of my cockpit audio on my personal device before we landed. I thought no one would believe us without proof. She pressed play. The recording was distorted, filled with static and engine noise. But beneath it all, faint but unmistakable, came a child's voice. It's okay, Dad, I'm still flying. David Chen, decorated combat pilot, hardened military instructor, a man who hadn't truly cried in 15 years, broke down completely. Sobs racked his body as he listened to his son's voice speaking words from beyond death. Morrison and Rodriguez sat in respectful silence, witnesses to a father's grief and impossible hope colliding in one devastating moment. When David finally composed himself, he looked at them both with raw vulnerability. His call sign was Phoenix. I gave it to him when he was 7. He drew a picture of a bird rising from flames and said, That's me, Dad. Even if I crash, I'll always rise up again. David's voice cracked. He was 8 years old when he died. He was clutching a toy F-22. He was whispering Phoenix when the plane went down. Jesus, Morrison whispered. The voice analysis team is working on the recordings now, David continued, wiping his eyes. They're going to find exactly what you found, something that shouldn't exist. A voice on a frequency that wasn't used. A transmission that came from nowhere. Sir, what does this mean? Rodriguez asked. David stood, walking to the window. Outside, an F-22 taxied across the tarmac, its engines glinting in the afternoon sun. It means my son kept his promise, he said softly. He promised me he'd keep flying no matter what, and he has. For 15 years he's been up there watching, waiting. Waiting for what? Morrison asked. David turned to face them, and for the first time in 15 years, something like peace touched his weathered features. Waiting for someone who needed him. Someone like you, Jake. Someone trapped in a falling aircraft over the same mountains where he died. Someone he could save because he understands exactly what it's like to be 8 years old and terrified and facing death. Rodriguez stood, approaching David carefully. Colonel, I know the Air Force is going to want to classify this. They're going to call it mass hysteria or equipment malfunction or anything that fits into their rational worldview. But we know what we heard. We know what happened." "Yes," David agreed, "we know." Morrison rose from the hospital bed, still unsteady but determined. "Sir, Marcus saved my life. Your son, wherever he is, whatever he is now, he saved my life. I owe him everything." David gripped Morrison's shoulder, the gesture both firm and tender. "He would have liked you, Jake, both of you. He would have wanted to fly alongside you." He paused, his voice thick with emotion. Thank you for hearing him. Thank you for listening." That evening, after the debriefs and the official reports and the carefully worded statements, David drove to the house on base housing. Sarah met him at the door, her eyes questioning. "It was him," David said simply. "It was Marcus. He spoke to them. He saved Morrison's life." Sarah's hand flew to her mouth, tears instantly streaming. How is that possible?" "I don't know, I don't understand it, but Sarah," David pulled her close, holding his wife for the first time in years. "Our boy kept his promise. He's still flying." They stood together in the doorway as the sun set over Nellie's Air Force Base. Two parents who had lost everything, learning that love might be stronger than death. That promises made by 8-year-old boys might echo across eternity. And that sometimes, impossibly, miraculously, the fallen can rise again. Phoenix had returned. The audio analysis lab at Nellie's Air Force Base hummed with tension. 3 of the military's top communications specialists huddled around computer screens displaying waveform patterns that defied every known principle of radio transmission. Dr. Patricia Valdez, a civilian contractor with 20 years of experience in signal analysis, removed her glasses and rubbed her tired eyes. "This is impossible," she muttered for the 10th time that evening. "The signal originated from empty airspace. No aircraft, no ground station, no satellite relay. It just appeared." Colonel David Chen stood behind them, his arms crossed, his face unreadable. He'd been there for 6 hours, watching them analyze and reanalyze the same impossible data. "Can you isolate the voice?" David asked. Dr. Valdez pulled up a cleaned audio file. She'd stripped away the static, the engine noise, the radio interference. What remained made her hands shake every time she played it. A child's voice, crystal clear. "Phoenix, listen carefully, kill your right engine now." Voice pattern analysis shows the speaker is approximately 8 to 10 years old, Dr. Valdez said, her professional composure cracking. "Male, native English speaker, possibly with a slight Western American accent. The vocal characteristics suggest." She paused, looking at David. "Colonel, I need to ask you something." "Ask." "Do you have any audio recordings of your son? Home videos, voicemails, anything?" David's jaw clenched. He pulled out his phone with trembling hands, navigating to a folder he hadn't opened in months. A video his wife had taken at Marcus's 7th birthday party. He pressed play. Young Marcus's voice filled the lab. Dad, watch this. I'm gonna fly all the way to the ceiling." Dr. Valdez's face went white. She pulled up the analysis software, running the birthday video through the same algorithm she'd used on the transmission. The vocal patterns, the frequency distributions, the harmonic structures, they matched. "That's not possible," one of the other specialists whispered. "The transmission voice and this recording, they're the same person." "But they can't be," another added desperately, "because that would mean that my son spoke to 2 pilots from beyond the grave," David finished quietly. "Yes, that's exactly what it means." The lab fell into stunned silence. These were men and women of science, people who dealt in electromagnetic frequencies and digital signals, not in miracles or ghosts or impossible resurrections. And yet the data didn't lie. "There's something else," Dr. Valdez said, pulling up another waveform. "At the very end of the transmission there's this." She played it. Through heavy static came those final, devastating words. "It's okay, Dad. I'm still flying." "The signal strength spikes right there," Dr. Valdez explained, her voice shaking. Like whoever was transmitting focused all their energy into that one message. And then, nothing. The signal just disappears. No fade out, no degradation. It's just gone like it was never there. David stared at the waveform pattern, seeing his son's voice translated into peaks and valleys of data. "Can you determine where the transmission originated from, geographically?" Dr. Valdez pulled up a triangulation map. A red circle appeared over the Sierra Nevada mountains, centered almost exactly on the coordinates where Flight 447 had crashed 15 years ago. "The signal came from right here," she said, pointing, "within 100 meters of your son's crash site." Sarah Chen sat in Marcus's room, the door open for the first time in weeks. David found her there an hour later, holding the framed photograph from that last morning at the air base. Marcus pressed against the fence, David's hand on his shoulder, both of them watching an F-22 streak across the sky. "They confirmed it," David said from the doorway. "Voice analysis matches. The transmission came from his crash site. It was him, Sarah. It was really him." Sarah looked up, her face streaked with tears but somehow lighter than it had been in years. "He came back for us. After all this time, he came back." David sat beside her on their son's bed. "No, not for us. For Morrison, for a pilot who needed him." He took Sarah's hand. "That's who Marcus was. That's who he always was. He would have become the kind of pilot who saves others, who risks everything to bring someone home. He got to do it sooner than we expected." "He called himself Phoenix," Sarah said, smiling through her tears. "Our brave little Phoenix." "He kept his promise," David replied. "He said he'd keep flying, and he has. For 15 years, Sarah. He's been up there, watching over every pilot who flies through those mountains. And when Morrison needed him most, when someone was about to die the same way he did, Marcus was there." Sarah squeezed his hand. "What do we do now? How do we live with knowing our son has been out there all this time, and we couldn't see him, couldn't hold him?" "We honor it," David said firmly. "We honor what he did. We honor who he was and who he still is." The next morning, David requested a meeting with Morrison and Rodriguez in his office. When they arrived, they found him standing by the window, looking calmer than they'd ever seen him. "Sit down, both of you," David said. "I want to tell you about my son." For the next hour, David shared stories he hadn't spoken aloud in 15 years. Marcus's obsession with aircraft, his drawings and calculations, his unwavering belief that he'd become the best pilot in the Air Force, the toy F-22 he'd carried everywhere, the promise David had made to take him flying. "The last thing he said to me," David continued, his voice steady despite the tears, was, "I promise, Dad, I promise I'll keep flying." He was trapped in a falling aircraft, knowing he was about to die, and he was thinking about promises. He looked at Morrison. "And then 15 years later, he saved your life, Jake, because he understood exactly what you were feeling, the terror, the helplessness, the certainty that you were going to die." Morrison's eyes glistened. "He didn't just save my life, sir. He gave me step-by-step instructions like he'd done it 1,000 times, like he'd been practicing for 15 years just for that moment." "Maybe he has been," Rodriguez said quietly. "Maybe every pilot who's flown through Sierra 7 in the last 15 years has had a guardian angel they never knew about. Maybe Marcus has been up there, watching, protecting, waiting for someone who needed what only he could give." David nodded slowly. "The Air Force is going to classify this. You know that. They'll call it equipment malfunction, mass hysteria, anything but what it actually was. They can't admit that a dead child saved a pilot through an impossible radio transmission." "Let them classify it," Morrison said firmly. "I know what happened. Rodriguez knows, you know, and that's enough." "There's one more thing," David said, pulling something from his desk drawer. It was the melted, warped remains of Marcus's toy F-22, still in its glass case. This was in his hand when they found him. He held onto it through the fire, through everything. It was the last thing he touched on Earth. He set the case on his desk where both pilots could see it. I've kept this as a reminder of what I lost, but maybe it's time I remember it differently. Not as a relic of tragedy, but as a symbol of a promise kept. Rodriguez stood, moving closer to examine the melted toy. Phoenix, she whispered, reading the call sign Marcus had written on the base in permanent marker, still visible despite the damage. He really was Phoenix, rising from the ashes, saving others even in death. Sir, Morrison said, standing beside Rodriguez, I have a request. I know it's probably against regulations, but I need to ask anyway. Go ahead. I want to visit the crash site. Both crash sites, Flight 447 and where my F-22 went down. I want to. I don't know, thank him, honor him, something. David studied the young pilot for a long moment. I go there every year on Marcus's birthday. This year, if you want, you can come with me, both of you. He paused. I think he'd like that. He'd want to meet the pilots he saved. When? Rodriguez asked. Tomorrow, David said. Tomorrow would have been his 23rd birthday. That night David lay in bed, in the master bedroom he'd avoided for 15 years, with Sarah beside him. They'd talked for hours, processing the impossible truth that their son had reached across death itself to save a life. Do you think he's at peace now? Sarah asked in the darkness. Do you think saving Morrison was what he needed to move on? David considered this. I don't think he needs to move on. I think he's exactly where he wants to be, flying, protecting others, being the pilot he always dreamed of becoming. He pulled Sarah closer. Our son isn't gone, Sarah. He's transformed. He's become something more than we ever imagined. Phoenix, Sarah whispered. Phoenix, David agreed. Outside, somewhere in the Nevada night, an F-22 roared across the sky on a training exercise. And for just a moment, so brief it might have been imagination, David could have sworn he heard a child's laughter carried on the wind. Young, joyful, free. Still flying. The sun rose over the Sierra Nevada mountains with a brilliance that seemed almost sacred. David Chen stood at the edge of the crash site where Flight 447 had ended 15 years ago, the morning air crisp and thin at this altitude. Beside him stood Sarah, her hand clasped tightly in his. Lieutenant Jake Morrison and Captain Emily Rodriguez stood respectfully a few paces back, still in their flight suits, having flown in at dawn. The memorial was modest, a simple bronze plaque mounted on a granite boulder, listing the names of the 44 souls lost. Marcus Anthony Chen, age 8. The letters were worn smooth by 15 years of David's fingers tracing them. Happy birthday, Phoenix, David whispered, kneeling before the plaque. I brought some people to meet you. Sarah placed fresh flowers, bright orange and red like flames, at the base of the memorial. Her tears fell freely, but her smile was genuine. For the first time in 15 years, this place didn't feel like a graveyard. It felt like something else, something holy. Morrison stepped forward, his young face serious with emotion. Marcus, he said, his voice carrying across the empty peaks, I don't know if you can hear me. I don't know how any of this works, but I need to say thank you. You saved my life. You talked me through the impossible and you gave me a second chance. I promise you I won't waste it. Every time I fly, I'll remember what you did. I'll remember Phoenix. Rodriguez joined him, placing her hand on the memorial. You were 8 years old when you died, she said softly. But the pilot who saved Jake had the skill and courage of someone who'd flown for decades. You became what you always dreamed of becoming, Marcus. The best pilot. The one who brings everyone home. David felt Sarah lean against him, both of them drawing strength from each other as they watched their son's memory being honored by the pilots he'd saved. The morning wind picked up, rustling through the sparse mountain vegetation, carrying a sound that might have been whispers or might have been something more. I'm sorry I took so long to understand, David said, his voice breaking. I thought losing you meant you were gone, but you were never gone. You've been flying all along just like you promised. I just couldn't see it through my grief." He reached into his jacket and pulled out the glass case containing Marcus's melted toy F-22. With trembling hands, he opened it for the first time since sealing it 15 years ago. The warped metal and plastic caught the morning light. "I've been holding on to this like it was all I had left of you," David continued. "But it's not. You left me so much more. You left me your courage, your joy, your unshakable belief that no dream is too big, no promise too hard to keep." He carefully removed the toy from its case. "And now I'm leaving this here with you, not as a relic of tragedy, but as a symbol of triumph. You kept flying, Phoenix. You rose from the ashes. You became exactly what you promised to become." David placed the toy fighter at the base of the memorial, nestled among Sarah's flowers. The permanent marker call sign, Phoenix, still visible despite the damage, caught the sunlight like a beacon. Morrison saluted. Rodriguez followed. Sarah pressed her hand to her lips and blew a kiss to the mountains. And David Chen, who hadn't truly smiled in 15 years, looked up at the vast Nevada sky and smiled through his tears. "Fly safe, son, until we meet again." 3 months later, Nellis Air Force Base held a ceremony that packed the auditorium beyond capacity. The establishment of the Phoenix Flight Safety Scholarship, endowed by Colonel David and Sarah Chen, would provide full aviation training to one deserving candidate each year. The recipient would carry the call sign Phoenix and would be charged with excellence, integrity, and the sacred duty of bringing everyone home. Lieutenant Jake Morrison was the first recipient. David stood at the podium, looking out at hundreds of pilots, young and old, seasoned and green, all gathered to honor the memory of an 8-year-old boy who'd become a legend. "My son Marcus never got to fly an F-22, David began, his voice strong and clear. "He never got to graduate flight school. He never got to serve his country in the cockpit of a fighter jet. But he understood something that took me 15 years to learn. Being a pilot isn't about the aircraft you fly or the medals you earn. It's about the people you protect, the lives you save, the promises you keep." He paused, finding Sarah in the front row, her face radiant with pride and sorrow mixed together. "Marcus Phoenix Chen kept his promise. He told me he'd keep flying no matter what. And 3 months ago, when Lieutenant Morrison's aircraft failed over the same mountains where Marcus died, my son proved that love is stronger than death, that promises echo across eternity, and that sometimes, impossibly, the fallen can rise again to save the living." The auditorium was silent, except for quiet weeping from multiple corners. "The Air Force has officially classified the incident as an unexplained radio phenomenon," David continued with a slight smile. "They're not wrong. It is unexplained. It is phenomenal, but we know the truth. Those of us who heard Marcus's voice, those of us who witnessed his final gift, we know that miracles aren't impossible. They're just rare, and they come when we need them most." He looked directly at Morrison. "Jake, you carry his call sign now. You carry his legacy. Fly with honor, fly with courage, and always, always bring everyone home. That's what Phoenix means. That's what my son taught us." Morrison stood, saluting with tears streaming down his face. The entire auditorium rose as one, hundreds of pilots saluting the memory of a boy who'd never officially worn the uniform but who'd embodied everything it represented. The official Air Force report, classified and filed deep in secure archives, concluded with a single line that would puzzle historians for generations. "Radio transmission source, unknown. Analysis inconclusive. Recommend no further investigation." But attached to that report was an unofficial note, handwritten by Colonel David Chen. "Sometimes the most important truths can't be measured by instruments or explained by science. My son saved a life. That's all that matters. That's all that ever mattered. Call D. Chen." 6 months after Morrison's rescue, David stood before his newest class of F-22 candidates. His reputation had changed. He was still demanding, still brilliant, but the cruel edge had softened. His students no longer feared him, they revered him. They understood that his intensity came not from anger but from love, love for his son, love for the sky, love for every pilot under his command. Flying is the most unforgiving endeavor humanity has ever undertaken, David told them, his voice carrying the weight of experience and loss and redemption. One mistake, one moment of inattention, and the sky will take everything from you. But he paused, looking up through the hangar windows at an F-22 streaking across the blue Nevada expanse. Sometimes, when you need it most, the sky gives back. Sometimes the pilots we've lost watch over us. Sometimes promises made by 8-year-old boys echo across eternity. Sometimes Phoenix rises from the ashes. The students listened, enraptured, sensing they were hearing something profound. You will fly, David continued. You will face danger. You will be tested beyond what you think you can endure. And in those moments, remember that you're never truly alone up there. Remember that the best pilots, the ones with the most courage, the most heart, sometimes watch over us from above. As if on cue, an F-22 roared overhead, close enough to rattle the hangar windows. The radio on David's desk crackled with brief static, and for just one impossible moment, everyone in that hangar heard something that shouldn't exist. A child's laughter, young, joyful, free. The sound faded quickly, leaving only stunned silence. David smiled, looking up at the ceiling as if he could see through metal and concrete to the sky beyond. Class dismissed. Go make your families proud. Go make Phoenix proud. As the students filed out, whispering excitedly about what they'd heard, Sarah appeared in the doorway. She'd been watching from outside, and her eyes told David she'd heard it too. He's still here, she said simply. He never left, David replied, pulling his wife close. And he never will. That's what it means to be Phoenix. You rise, you endure, you protect, forever. They stood together in the hangar doorway, watching F-22s take off into the brilliant Nevada sky, each one carrying pilots who would return home safe because somewhere up there, an 8-year-old boy with a toy fighter jet and an unbreakable promise was watching over them all. Marcus Phoenix Chen, born to fly, forever soaring, always protecting. The promise had been kept. The end.
Mannaggia. Un po' too much questo livello qui, ti devo dire. Cioè, devo mettermi in una posizione... È capire un pezzo dietro l'altro. Invece, come facevo prima, a me piace di più cercare di capire il gioco e poi muovermi. Ok? Così. E così per andare sopra. Perlomeno da là sopra posso sempre far tutto. Allora, sarebbe una roba del genere. Lo mettiamo più in qua possibile. Poi blu qui. E qui. Ok. Fammi andare ancora un po' in qua. A posto. Ora. Mettiti più in qua. Là. Ok. Minchia, se non ci arrivo impazzisco. Non c'ho vero dietro le porte, no? Devo arrivarci. Ok. Ok.